With the economy tanking, millions out of work across the globe, people are reevaluating their relationship with the federal government, including what their tax burden should be in order to create a stronger social safety net and decrease income inequality.
One economist was already way ahead of the curve on all of this. French economist Thomas Piketty describes inequality as a political choice. His latest book, Capital and Ideology, charts a global history of inequality along with how societies justify that choice. And Thomas joins us now via Skype for more on this. Great to see you, sir.
Hello.
So just lay out for us what you wanted to sort of accomplish with this book. What did you want to lay out for people?
Okay, so this is a book about the history of inequality over time across societies. And I guess one of the main lessons from history is that societies always need to reinvent their economic model. And I think this is certainly something we're going to have to do after this crisis. But what you see in history is, well, first, there's a long-run evolution toward a reduction in inequality. So this may seem a bit paradoxical, especially today after the last decades have seen a big increase in inequality. But if you take a broader, long-run comparative perspective, you see a pretty large decline in inequality. Today we have more equality in the US, in Europe, than we had at the beginning of the 20th century or in the 20th century. And this was a very successful process. I will argue that economic prosperity has largely come from this increase in equality, in particular in education. And so in the long run, this reduction in inequality has been a key component in how our societies became richer. And I think we need to continue in this direction in the long run. And that's the message of the book is that, there's nothing natural in particular levels of inequality that we see. There's nothing natural in the way our economy is organized. It's all a matter of political choices, of ideology. And what I try to show in my book is that, things can change very quickly. And you can see throughout history, I look at many different episodes in France, in the US, in India, in Brazil, in Sweden, in South Africa, in China. And through this world tour on the history of inequalities, the key conclusion is really that the main determinants of different levels of inequality or equality are primarily political and ideological rather than simply economic or technological.
Mm-hmm. So, Thomas, right now I think we're living through one of those historical inflection points that you're talking about. What are some of the lessons that we can learn from past inflection points where we tried to grapple with inequality and how government policy can fix it? What type of political choices should we be making now in order to make sure that we live in a better society after this crisis?
Well, first, we need more equality in education, more equality in health, and health system, in safety net system. And I am very concerned, with this crisis, that it will hit very badly, the more disadvantaged socioeconomic groups in the US, in Europe, and even more so at the world level. I'm very concerned that the strategy to lock people down in their home, could be very inefficient in poor countries where you don't have a safety net, where you don't have unemployment insurance, where you don't have minimum income, and I think it should be an opportunity. We should use this opportunity to develop more the social state, the social policies in general, by which I mean a better, income support mechanism, safety net, and better access to education and health. And this process of building a more equal society has been one of the key to economic success in the West over the past century. This has not been taken so far, this route has not been taken so far in Africa or in India, partly, because recommendation of international organizations since the 1980s, 1990s with the Washington Consensus were very much against more public investment in education, health, were against progressive taxation of income and wealth. And, I think that today, after the 2008 financial crisis, but also after this 2020 epidemic crisis, we have to revisit some of our ideology, some of what we believe was the conventional wisdom at a given point in time, and move into a more egalitarian development trajectory. There are also lessons from history about more specific issues like what do you do with a big public debt, and because we are going to end up at the end of this crisis with very large public debt in the US, in Europe, and particularly in countries like Italy, and there's really a question: what are we going to do with it? And again, one of the lessons from history is that you see episodes. Well, first you see a big diversity of episodes and trajectories, and probably that's the main lesson from history: is that we have choices, we have different possible choices. The idea is that there's only one way to organize the economy or one way to deal with the public debt is just wrong on the face of it. So, for instance, let me take an example. And after World War II, both Germany and Japan, by 1950 or by the late 1940s, had enormous public debt, partly because of the burden of reconstruction. And then what these two countries decided is that, in fact, they will reduce drastically their public debt by having an exceptional wealth tax on very high wealth taxpayer, in particular very large financial portfolio, which were taxed up to 80-90% in Germany and Japan between 1948 and 1952. And if you look at this episode retrospectively, I think it's fair to say that this was a huge success in the sense that it allowed these two countries to start their reconstruction in the 1950s, to start again with no public debt, and this gave them more financial possibilities to invest in public infrastructure, invest in education, in health. And I think it's really important to revisit this episode today. That doesn't mean we are going to do exactly the same thing, but we have to invent our own way using lessons from the past.
Right. Well, the point is to recognize the mythology that we've bought into, realize that it is just that, mythology, and different societies over time, even different, our own society over time has had a different mythology and set of values and principles, which means that you can change the reality of what exists today. I wanted to ask you, obviously here in the U.S., the left has just suffered a major political blow. And one of the things that concerns a lot of folks here that I think is reflected around the world in terms of a leftist political ideology is that the Democratic Party is becoming increasingly centered around sort of affluent, white-collar professionals rather than the historic base of the working class. And so that's meant that they've tended not to focus on sort of populist economic well-being of working class and lower income people, but rather more cultural issues that are more top of mind and important to progressive-minded, affluent, white-collar professionals. How do you deal with that? How do you reorient a party? How do you have a sort of leftist vision here in the U.S. and around the world that actually appeals to the white, black, and brown working class as a multiracial coalition?
Well, I think you need to have a more ambitious policy platform of giving a better chance to the more disadvantaged socioeconomic groups. So we're talking about higher minimum wage, more investment in public universities, public health, more progressive taxation at the top. Let me remind you that the billionaire tax proposed by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren was actually pretty popular if you look at the polls and opinion polls, and including Republican voters were supporting the billionaire tax, and I think it will be a big mistake for the Democratic Party leadership to abandon this kind of idea. I think it's the opposite. I think Joe Biden will be well inspired to borrow some of the ideas put forward by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, including the wealth tax, because I think what many people have shown, including Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman, is that if you only have an income tax, you have some people at the very top who have very, very high wealth, but who sort of somehow manage to have relatively low fiscal income. And if you don't have a wealth tax, there's no way to make them contribute at a decent level. And I think it's important to send a message to working America and to low-wage America that you can have economic justice together with economic prosperity. And in fact, one of the big lessons from the history of American economic success is that you can have more economic prosperity with more economic justice. And let me simply say this, American economic leadership historically came from the fact that the US as a country was a great leader in terms of education. It was more educated and in many ways more equally educated than Europe. In the middle of the 20th century, in the 1950s, you had almost 100% of a generation going to high school, whereas in Europe or in Japan at the time it was 20-30%. So there was a huge educational advance with a relatively egalitarian system, at least as compared to other countries. Now this educational leadership has been lost. And there's been a new narrative starting in the 1980s with Reagan, according to which the source of prosperity, and US prosperity in particular, should be more inequality, more concentration of wealth in a small group. Now, 30 years later, if you look at what happened, in fact, the growth rate has been divided by 2. I think it's really important to look at the numbers, to look at the historical record. Between 1990 and 2020, the growth rate of national income per capita in the US has been only 1.1% per year, as opposed to 2.2% between 1950 and 1990. So when you compare very long period of time like this, I think it's very difficult to say that the Reaganian strategy of having more inequality in order to boost innovation and economic growth did good to the country.
Right. Yeah. Well, Thomas, it's so great to see you. Congratulations on the book. And, for our viewers out there, Capital and Ideology, Thomas is one of the most important economic thinkers in the entire world. Highly recommend the book.
Yeah.
We're so grateful for your time, and we hope you're doing well.
Great discussion, Thomas. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Next week on Rising, we have another amazing week planned with more guests, including friends of the show Zed Jelani and Ryan Grimm, as well as some amazing panelists like Jennifer Holdsworth, Rachel Bovard, Marshall Kosloff, and so much more.
That's right. Remember to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our videos. Don't forget to like and share as well. And we will see you all next week.
Enjoy, everybody.